Eesti keeles, et ütlen veel kord tere, et loodetavasti on meid rohkem ka YouTube'i kanalil kuulamas, aga minu nimi on Maris Leemets ja mul on täna hea meel Eesti Panga teadusseminaride raames vastu võtta siis 2 külalist IMFist, kes tutvustavad IMFi teadusosakonna tööd rahapoliitika teemal ja toormeturgude fragmenteerituse teemal. And now I switch to English so that our guests would also understand. Welcome everyone, and a special warm welcome to our guests from the IMF. I'm very glad that you can actually present us the World Economic Outlook 2 chapters, which were just out like 7 days ago. And so we have first Allan Dizioli. He is already ready to start his presentation on managing expectations and on inflation and monetary policy, and then later Jorge Alvarez will continue and talk about the commodity markets and fragmentation. So first enjoy. You are all welcome to ask questions during the presentation or after, however you like, but please ask for a microphone so that the people in YouTube could also hear what you ask. So yeah, please, Allan, the floor is yours.
Thank you for hosting us here in the Bank of Estonia. It's a pleasure to present, and like I said, I'll be happy to take questions as I go. It's more entertaining for me and probably more entertaining for you too, so just stop me as you want. So I like to point things out because also it helps me to present, so I hope everybody can see when I point things out. So this presentation is the chapter 2 of the October WEO, World Economic Outlook, and we talk about managing expectations. So expectations, inflation, and monetary policy. So the motivation slide, it's I don't think I ever presented something that didn't need as much motivation as this, but anyway, we still have the motivation slide, so we know that inflation came up quite a bit at the beginning of 2022. And then since mid-2022, inflation started quickly coming down, especially with the normalization of energy prices. However, core inflation remained quite sticky for a more prolonged period of time. So this behavior, it's really what interests us and what we're really going to focus on in this presentation. So the first part is for me, it was quite interesting to see that if you ask professional forecasters, they are actually predicting that inflation is just going to go back to targeting most of the countries just in 2026. No? So this is quite a prolonged period of time from now, right? So it's just 3 years. So it is quite, for me it was shocking when I first saw this, because usually you imagine these professional forecasters just forecasting the target quickly. So having them forecasting inflation just going back to target after 3 years, it was kind of shocking. So with that, then it begs the question of what's going to happen to expectations, right? Because if you have inflation above target for so prolonged period of time, you might imagine that inflation expectations might become the anchor. So people might start believing that inflation is never going to go back to target. And this is also what we will talk in this presentation. So we have 3 main questions that we try to answer here. So the first one is about what happened to inflation expectations. We looked at, so before and after the pandemic, before and after the increase in inflation, we look at short-term, long-term inflation expectations in different nations, and we just kind of document that. So what happened to inflation expectations? Then we talk about how inflation expectations matter for inflation dynamics. So how much of now current inflation is explained by inflation expectations. And then finally, one interesting question for central banks is how monetary policy effectiveness is affected by inflation expectations, and how monetary policy can affect inflation expectations, and how inflation expectations can affect monetary policy. Right, so the first question, so when you talk about inflation expectations, there are several ways to ask this question, several agents that you can ask this question. So we put the 4 categories there, like the main categories, if you think in a sense. So we have the professional forecasters, households, financial markets, and then we also have firms. So one contribution of this chapter was to create an index for firms' inflation expectations. If you ever look for this data, you see that there is not a lot of data of firms' inflation expectations. So what this chapter did was to develop an indicator based on earnings transcript calls with investors. So companies that actually have these calls and then they have these transcripts, then we use text mining techniques to extract how much firms are actually concerned to inflation. And then from this, we validated this index and we show that our is a very good way to proxy firms' inflation expectations. So this index is available now for several countries. So as long as a country has some market capitalization, so some companies that actually have their stocks and they have to talk to investors, this index is available for that specific country. Then we also talk about expectations in different horizons, so which I think is another important contribution of this chapter, is to look at what is important. Is the short-term, long-term inflation expectations, has this changed over time? And then we finalize this first part looking at some historical episodes, so comparing the current inflationary environment to past inflationary episodes that look like what happened this time. So looking at the different agents, so we have there 4 different countries and regions. So we're just selecting these countries and regions because those are the only ones that we could actually find inflation expectations for all the different categories. So then the first thing to look at is like how, of course they're not exactly the same. So first, these are standardized measures. So the number 4 there just means that inflation expectations went up 4 times standard deviations compared to history. So first thing to look at is that even though there are some differentiations, so you see that household inflation expectations in the UK were not as high as firms and the professional forecasters. Like in the US, you see financial markets, and in the euro area financial markets, inflation expectations coming down a lot quicker. So you see some differentiation, but I just like to point out that most of the broad dynamics, they look about the same, right? So you see that inflation went up broadly at the same time, and then it started coming down broadly at the same time in most of the different agents. So in a sense, the different agents, they bring some information, but if you look at one of the measures, you're not missing a lot of not looking at the other measures, at least at the median. That's what we're pointing out there. So then, what about inflation expectations at the different horizons? No? So at the top there, we have inflation expectations at the 12-month ahead inflation expectations, and down here we have the 5 years ahead inflation expectations. So 2 things to highlight there. So first is how inflation expectations in the near term went up in both in advanced economies and in emerging markets. However, the long-term inflation expectations were really close to target, so 0 there is just the target. Another interesting thing to point out is that there is not a lot of differentiation between emerging markets and advanced economies. So if you look there, it's broadly the same. So the same message, right? So short-term inflation expectations went up, but long-term inflation expectations were broadly anchored. Which is kind of surprising given the history of inflation in emerging market economies. However, of course, the skewness of emerging markets is a lot larger because we do have the Argentinas and Turkeys in this sample, of course. So with that, this slide talks about, so how special is this inflationary episode compared to history? No? With that, so we selected we look at data since the 1989 to 2023, and we look for, in every country data set, we look for this kind of criteria here. So if for 4 quarters we saw inflation expectations at 1 and a 5 years ahead horizon going up, then we selected that country at that point in time as one of the episodes. So with this criteria, we selected 32 past episodes, and we have 16 AEs and 16 emerging market economies. And in these episodes, then we just plotted, so the point 0 there, so it's after the 4 quarters of rising 1 year and 5 years ahead inflation expectations, and then we just see what happens from that point on. Huh? So first thing that I would like to point out is how special this episode was for near-term inflation expectations. So you see that inflation expectations went up quite a bit before the start of the episode, but then it started coming down a lot faster too than in history. You know? So this is interesting, right? Because at the same time, if you look at the core inflation right here, inflation expectations are pretty much aligned with historical patterns. So we have kind of a disconnect between near-term inflation expectations and core inflation in this episode compared to previous episodes. However, it's also interesting to compare how the real policy rate also have changed. No? So in normal episodes, the real policy rate had actually started coming down before we started to track in the episode. Meanwhile, in this episode, we saw that the real policy rate was highly accommodative before it started a really fast tightening. No? So this V-shape can actually help to explain why we might be seeing something like this in terms of short-term inflation expectations. Okay, so with that, we ended the first part of the presentation. We talk about just data, right? So now we do some econometric analysis. So the main question of this part of the presentation is to try to see how much inflation expectations to help to explain inflation now. We also look at the explanatory power of the different inflation expectations measures, so like the different agents, how their inflation expectations matter for inflation. We also look at how short-term and long-term inflation expectations, their relative explanatory power for inflation. We also try to do some causality of inflation expectations to inflation. Anybody who has ever studied this know that there is a huge endogeneity, of course, because inflation affects inflation expectations that affect inflation, so this is highly endogenous. And we talk a little bit about the endogeneity if you just use a simple OLS estimator. And then finally, we use our estimated model to do some historical decompositions to see how much inflation expectations matter for inflation right now. And then we do some state dependence analysis. The state dependence just means that does it matter if you have high or low inflation for the pass-through of inflation expectations to inflation or not, right? So it's just like how special it is that we are in a high inflation versus a low inflation environment. Okay, so with that, the first question to look at is the comparison between the short-term and the long-term inflation expectations. So this is one of the more interesting results of the chapter. So first, if you look at up there, you see that the explanatory factor here, so it's like about 0.7 on average, of the near-term inflation expectations is a lot larger than the explanatory factor of the long-term inflation expectations to inflation. Which means, in other words, that near-term inflation expectations explain inflation a lot more than the long-term inflation expectations. So if a central bank really wants to know, wants to use a measure to see what inflation expectations matter, it should probably be looking at near-term inflation expectations more than long-term inflation expectations. We also see that if you look at the professional forecasters, financial market, or firms, the explanatory factor is about the same. Meanwhile, the households, the explanatory factor is a lot lower. So that's another interesting thing to look at. So, of course, household can bring some information, but they bring less information than the other agents. So that kind of concludes this part. And then looking at the different coefficients for the different regions, we see that lagged inflation matters a lot more for emerging markets than it does for advanced economies. So that doesn't mean that lagged inflation doesn't matter for advanced economies, but it just means that probably lagged inflation just affects near-term inflation expectations. So there is no additional explanatory power for lagged inflation once you control for near-term inflation expectations. Okay, so now we talk a little bit about the explanatory factor, we try to do some causality tests, right? So actually seeing how inflation expectations are causing inflation. As I mentioned, it's highly endogenous, right? So of course, current inflation affects inflation expectations. So to try to come up with an identification assumption, we use recent results from the behavior literature about how people form inflation expectations. So one key thing that the behavioral literature found out was that people, when they form inflation expectations or any kind of expectations, they adapt slowly, right? So even if they believe that things completely change, they do not adjust immediately their inflation expectations. So this fact gives us a strategy to instrument for inflation expectations. And the strategy is this, right? So our identifying assumption is that lagged inflation expectations, lagged inflation expectations only affect current inflation through their impact on current inflation expectations, which is kind of like this regression here. So, so this is might be a strong assumption, but then again, what we do, we even lagged even further inflation expectations. So just idea again. So what people thought about what inflation today was going to be 2 years ago, that's what our instrumental variable for current inflation expectations. With this assumption, then we estimate the model, and then we show a little bit of the endogeneity problem of using a simple OLS estimator. Right? So first, if you look at the coefficient on the near-term inflation expectations, so in theory, our initial Phillips curve predicted this coefficient should be around 1. So having a coefficient that is so much larger than 1 causes a little bit of a problem for the new Keynesian Phillips curve. However, when we use our IV approach, so when we instrument for past inflation expectations, we see that this coefficient dropped quite a bit for both for advanced economists and for EMs. So if you just estimate the Phillips curve using OLS, you have a highly biased, positively biased effect on near-term inflation expectations. We also see some important thing for modelers that once you control for the endogeneity, the effect of the output gap on inflation increases quite a bit in both in advanced economies and in emerging markets. So the output gap matters for inflation more once you control for this endogeneity. And we also see that so lagged inflation, once you control for the endogeneity, lagged inflation doesn't have much more impact on AEs. Right, so once you have this less biased estimation for the impact of inflation expectations to inflation, we can explain history and see how much of the current inflation is explained by inflation expectations. So that chart there, so the gray bar includes everything, right, that is not inflation expectations. So it includes the output gap, includes cost push shocks, for example, COVID supply shocks, includes the energy shocks from the Russian war. So you see that at the beginning of the inflationary episode for advanced economies and for EMs, most of the increase in inflation was driven by these other factors, right? Could be the supply or demand. Right? But then more recently, you see that the role of inflation expectations have become a lot more important for both for EMs and for AEs and for EMs. So this is interesting because if you think about it, so now the central banks are facing a different inflation. At the beginning, they were facing an inflation that was driven by supply, mostly supply factors, cost push shocks. Right now, they're facing an inflation that is driven by second-round effects, if you want to think, or inflation that is driven by inflation expectations. So right now, central banks are facing a different battle, if you want to think about this, if we believe in this interpretation of the model. So finally, we finished this part of the second part of the presentation, looking at how special it is that we have high inflation compared to low inflation in terms of non-linearity. So we looked at so how much inflation expectations matter for inflation. So how that coefficient on our regression changes if you are in a high inflationary environment compared to a low inflationary environment. We see here for advanced economists, it does matter, and doesn't matter quite a bit. So if you are in a high inflationary environment, inflation expectations pass through more to inflation than if you are in a low inflationary environment. So this creates a non-linear effect for inflation expectations to inflation that central banks should be watching for in a high inflationary environment. Okay, so now the last part of the presentation is about how monetary policy affects inflation expectations and how inflation expectations affect monetary policy. So this is all model-based analysis, based on a simple DSG model. So first thing that we look at is how does the share of backward-looking learners, and I'm going to talk more about what it means to be Asians like this, affect the cost to lower inflation or disinflation, the famous sacrifice ratio. Then we look at some policies. We look at cyclical and structural policies and how those affect and how those play out to lower inflation. So what are the channels that those policies can lower inflation? And then we finally finish this presentation with what do we expect going forward, right? So under different scenarios, how long should we expect to wait until inflation gets back to target? So the first part of the analysis, we answer all the questions we have in this part using this DSG model, which is based on a very simple. So the core of the model is a very simple model. So we have an IS curve, which basically relates the output gap with real interest rates. We have price and wage Phillips curves, and we have an estimated monetary policy reaction function. What is new about this model is that we have two kinds of agents. So it's a heterogeneous agent model. They have agents that are what we call the forward-looking learners. They have full information, and we have the backward-looking learners. And we talk more about what it means, these two kinds of agents. And we include the two kinds of expectations in the model. So we do have short-term and long-term inflation expectations a la Bernanke and Blanchard. So why does this matters? Because in the end, the model is also tracking inflation expectations, observed long-term and short-term inflation expectations. So the estimation of the model is also guided by observed inflation, near-term and long-term inflation expectations. Okay, so what are these two kinds of learners? So the heterogeneity of agents. No? So the backward-looking learners are agents that form their inflation expectations based on the past. So it could be any kind of model, statistical model that you can think of. It could be a VAR, it could be even machine learning, it could be any model, but the only restriction we have is that it is only based on past information. So we cannot use any information right now to predict the effects. So any forward-looking component is skewed in this kind of expectations. And what we call them learners, it's because if you think about their statistical model here, is time dependent. So this is a very key assumption in this model, because through this assumption we can create an endogenous de-anchoring in the model. So if inflation starts coming, the realized inflation started coming a lot higher than actual inflation for a prolonged period of time, people start believing that the inflation target is no longer valid, right? So they started adjusting, for example, these coefficients here, the beta coefficients larger, right? So part of this econometric model here is to estimate the average of inflation in the future. So if inflation start coming higher, agents start learning and start believing that the central bank target is not achievable anymore. And then we create this problem for the central bank that then is a lot harder to bring inflation back to target. So this is quite different from a rational expectations model that everything is always credible. So every shock we have, the shock really dies quickly because we have this very strong anchoring mechanism that is just the rational expectations mechanism. In this model, if you let it run for a long period of time, then it becomes a lot harder. So things become a lot more persistent. And we also have the rational expectations learners, or the forward-looking learners, that are very similar to our rational expectations agents in any other model. The only difference is that they are even smarter than our rational expectations agents, because they also know that there are backward-looking learners in the economy. Right? So if you think about this, it's like if 99% of the Asians are backward-looking learners, then the rational people rationally behave like the backward-looking too. It's not rational for them to behave in a forward-looking way because they know that the economy behaves as if it was a backward-looking economy. So the share of these agents is also estimated as part of all the parameters in the model. The share of these agents is also estimated, and this estimated share is important for the results we are going to discuss. So first, what is the implication of having this heterogeneous agents model? So first and more important is when the economy is hit by a cost push shock, what happens, right? So you see that inflation is a lot more persistent than in the rational expectations model. And why does it happen? So the main mechanism is through inflation expectations. So the backward-looking learners, once they see inflation coming in higher, they just believe that inflation is going to be permanently higher, so they adjust their inflation expectations higher, and this just feeds through inflation, that feeds into inflation expectations, so there is a feedback loop here, and that prolongs the inflationary episode. And this happens despite monetary policy being a lot tighter here than in the rational expectations model. So here, in a sense, like the rational expectations model, just the threat of increasing interest rates, it's already enough to bring inflation down. They don't have to do much. Just the threat is already enough. Meanwhile, here, they have to do a lot more, right, to bring inflation down. And so, but that's a bad combination for central banks, right? Because here we have a situation where central banks are tightening policy a lot more, but it's quite ineffective because inflation it's higher for a more prolonged period of time. So this hints that the monetary policy is less effective when we have these heterogeneous agents in the model. And this is exactly what the second part is showing. So when we have exactly the same interest rate tightening, you see that inflation falls more in the rational expectations model than in the heterogeneous agents model, because inflation expectations also fall by more than in the heterogeneous agents model. So this combination hints to the next slide here that talks about the sacrifice ratio. So what is the sacrifice ratio? So this is how much output you lose to lower inflation by 1% after 3 years using only monetary policy. So it's a very specific definition, and I want to highlight this just because if you look at the literature, sacrifice ratio is defined in several different ways. So once you know these models and you play with these models, that matters a lot, right? So how you define how you get there, it matters a lot of the number that you eventually get. So that's why we use this very precise definition, which is a definition used in some papers. So I hinted before that monetary policy loses effectiveness, and this is exactly what this slide shows, right? So if you look at the, when you have the rational expectations model compared to the heterogeneous agents model, the output cost to lower inflation is a lot higher in the heterogeneous agents model than in the rational expectations. And we also see that for emerging markets, this is a lot worse, right? So you see that the cost of bringing inflation down is a lot higher for emerging markets than it is for advanced economies. So a big part of why this happens is because the estimated share of backward-looking learners in emerging markets is larger than in advanced economies. So that's something very important that we will hint later. But then, so this drives a lot of the results of the losing potency of monetary policy. So finally there, I was just pointing out that the non-linearity of the model, so the endogenous de-anchoring. So what we did here in the last part was like, what if you do exactly the same exercise, but you let inflation to run above target for 8 quarters, right? So it's a situation similar to now. So that we just seen inflation higher than the target for 8 quarters, and then the central bank at that point in time started to try to lower inflation. If that happens, then you see that the output cost is larger than the output cost of bringing inflation down in a low inflationary environment. Okay, so with that, so we have this model. So what this model tells us about policies. So first thing is, and the first thing we want to emphasize, so when there is a high increase, so when we have an inflationary episode, so the first line of defense is the line of defense that we all know. So tighter cyclical policy, so tighter fiscal policy, tighter monetary policy. That's what the central banks and the governments should be doing when they have inflationary episode. So this is exactly what we show in this chart. So like we have an inflationary episode, and then we have the fiscal and monetary policy reaction. However, so what is the mechanisms that the cyclical policies affect inflation? So there are two ways that if you think about a Phillips curve, two ways that the central bank can affect inflation. It can affect inflation through the output gap, which is very costly and is very unpopular for central banks because you increase unemployment, you lower the output, so you make people unhappy, or you can lower inflation through inflation expectations, which does not have an output cost. So in theory, the central banks just want to affect inflation expectations and have no impact on the output gap. In practice, this is a lot harder to do. So, but you see here, so that when they have cyclical policies, you have the output gap contracting quite a bit. It doesn't matter if you have fiscal or monetary policy. And then this contraction in the output gap leads to lower inflation. So mostly to the output gap. And then, of course, once inflation starts coming down, that feeds into inflation expectations that then also helps to lower inflation. So at the beginning, the initial fall is mostly coming just from the output gap. And then eventually, inflation expectations also help to lower inflation. But that, of course, then has a high output cost, right? So then in this chapter, we talk about how can central banks lower the cost of this inflation, right? So how can they achieve a better sacrifice ratio? So in the chapter, we talk a lot about monetary policy frameworks and communication strategies. So the IMF, we developed this index that basically tried to compare three things, right? So relatively how credible the central bank is, how the communication strategy of the central bank is, and how independent the central bank is. With this, we show several things. So the first thing we show is that the fraction of forward-looking agents, when we have a better monetary policy frameworks, is higher. And this is what it helps us to simulate in this scenario, right? So in this scenario, we just look at the estimated share of backward-looking learners in advanced economies and in emerging markets. We compare the two, and the scenario that we do is just like, okay, so what if we assume that the number of rational people just increased by the difference of the estimation share of these two different groups, which in this case is just 5%. So, but in other words, what if we have just 5% more rational expectations or forward-looking learners in the economy? If we do have this kind of agents, then we are able to lower inflation mostly through inflation expectations with very minimal output gap. So the idea here is just that through communications, through better policies, central banks can increase the share of these forward-looking learners, can improve the understanding of agents of how monetary policy operates, and can lower, so it can increase the inflation expectations channel of monetary policy and can lower the output gap once the central bank starts in a tightening cycle. So in this final part we talk about all this very important question of how long it's going to take to bring inflation back to target. So to answer this question, we do a different exercise. So far, we just use the estimated monetary policy reaction function. So what is this like very long name, right? So when we estimate this function, we estimate how central banks usually behave. But this part, we don't use this term anymore. And what we do, we use what we call the optimal monetary policy. The optimal monetary policy tries to minimize a welfare loss function. And the welfare loss function is basically trying to minimize the interest rates deviations, the output gap deviation from target, and inflation from target. So this becomes a non-linear function if you think, right? Because if, for example, inflation is quite far from target, then the central bank is going to react very differently from if inflation expectation is close to target. So if you use this optimal policy, and we have a very persistent shock, so a cost per shock, the central bank might take a very long time here, it's like 4 years to bring inflation back to target if we have backward-looking learners in the economy. So that's the first thing to notice, is that as more backward-looking people there are in your economy, it takes a lot longer to bring inflation back to target. So you see that in the rational expectations, it's about half a year before than in the heterogeneous agent model. The second thing is, like, so it takes a long time, but why it takes a long time? Because we have a very persistent shock, right? So what if you have a less persistent shock? So of course, like, it takes a lot less time. So it would take around 2 years, and we just show this to give so this is a range, right? Because we really don't know how persistent this cost push shock is, right? So yeah, so it could be 4 years, but it could be a lot less. But even if it's a 4 years, so the central banks can bring inflation down a lot sooner, but then there is, of course, a trade-off, right? So what if the central bank decides to completely ignore the output gap and just follow, just minimize a welfare function that only has inflation deviations from target and interest rate smoothing? In this case, the central bank, of course, can tighten policy a lot more and can bring inflation back to target in just 2 years. And if it does this, of course, there is some welfare cost associated to this, right? So this slide just shows that, of course, central banks in this case can bring inflation back to target sooner, but of course there is some welfare cost associated to this. And to finalize, is just saying that yes, it is important how many heterogeneous agents model there are in the economy for this prolonged period of time to go back to target. Okay, so with that, I'll conclude with 2 slides. So first, like, we looked at the inflation expectations in the near term rose quite sharply, 4 standard deviations from historical average, which is like, so 4 standard deviations is highly on the tail. So this episode was very unique. Even with this very high increase in near-term short inflation expectations, we saw that long-term inflation expectations continue to be highly anchored at the central bank targets. So this combination is quite special. And then we look in terms of historical episodes, how this compares. And we saw that in history, it took on average 3 years to bring inflation back to target. So if you think about the professional forecasters, just imagine that inflation is going to take 3 years. This is quite consistent to our historical episodes. Then we look at near-term inflation expectations is more important to determine inflation than long-term inflation expectations measures. And then we also see that there is some nonlinearities. So when inflation is high, inflation expectations become even more important to explain inflation. And then finally, with the policy slides, we saw that central banks should monitor the number of people forming inflation expectations in a backward-looking way, because it is more costly for central banks to bring inflation back to target, and central banks should behave differently if they see more agents behaving in a backward-looking way. We saw that if we have a very persistent cost push shock and we have a lot of backward-looking agents, it might take a long time for the central banks to bring inflation back to target. The only way to bring it faster will be at some welfare losses. And finally, we also talk about how improving monetary policy frameworks can lower the costs of disinflation. So having better communications, independence, and more credible central banks can achieve at a lower cost inflation back to target, or increasing the chances of a softer landing. With that, I will take questions from you.
Thank you very much. I had one question in the beginning. You showed that also the dispersion of the inflation expectations are much higher now than, in this episode, are much higher now than before. That does this have any bearing, or is it very much correlated with the high inflation versus low inflation regime, that it already this captures the fact? So essentially, I want to know whether you found something that the dispersion of expectations affect inflation.
Yeah, so the dispersion of inflation expectations, right? So this is a question that we did not address in the chapter, but so there are literature now looking at this, and I think the main result of this literature, which I think it's quite interesting, is that if you're going to have two kind of distributions, right? So with the same median, so you can have a distribution like this, so just a standard normal distribution with inflation expectations, and you can have like a bimodal distribution like this. And if you look at the bimodal or the single mode, they can have exactly the same median inflation expectations. But if you have a bimodal, the literature have shown that you have a higher chance of having higher inflation and more persistent inflation. But this is not our result, so this is results from other people, but it shows that, so looking at the full distribution and not only at the median, it is important metric that central banks should follow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. So I'm Dmitry from the research department. I just have a question about the share of the backward-looking learners, how you call them. Is there a way of like measuring the share somehow? Are there any statistics that can help us to do? Thank you.
Yeah. So what we do, the model tracks some observable variables, right? So it tracks inflation, output gap, wages, real interest rates, and then short-term and long-term inflation expectations. The idea of the model is just to track these variables as best as possible. So we estimate the share so that the model does a better job in explaining short-term and long-term inflation expectations. So if you think that if the underlying process for the short-term and long-term inflation expectations is very backward-looking, then the share, when we estimate the model, then the share is larger, right? So that what it drives. So in a sense, like if you look at the persistence of the inflation expectations process is what it drives this share of backward-looking learners. Yeah, direct ways we don't. Yeah, it's all done through them. Yeah.
Hi, Lena Uskula from Luminar Bank. I was wondering, what is the good thing for the society? Is anchored inflation expectations always a tool, the best thing we can achieve, or is it better to have a realistic view that households actually get it to the right point?
Yeah, so that's a very, very, very smart question, because in a sense, for central banks, it's just better if people don't pay attention to inflation. So if agents just believe that the central bank target is always going to be achieved, so in a sense, for central banks, it's just better if people just are rationally inattentive than it is if they are paying attention to inflation. However, this is, of course, once you have a highly inflationary episode, this it's not achievable anymore, because then people start paying attention to inflation. So it is better for the central bank that people don't pay attention, but once inflation is high, people start paying attention to inflation. And if you are in this situation, it's better that people then are more rational, so that people start knowing what the goal of the central bank is when it's tightening policy. So it is better for the central bank that people are more rational. So at a low inflationary, well, the first best case for the central bank is that people don't pay attention. But if they are paying attention, it's better if they're rational and not backward looking. So that's the way I would respond to this question. So then I'll follow up, which is interesting one. So we also show part of the chapter is so we have these inflation expectations at the firm level, and we show that firms that pay more attention to the central bank, in general, when there is a monetary policy tightening, they believe that inflation expectation is going to fall more than if they're not paying attention to the central bank. So empirically, we show that it is good for the central bank if people are paying attention to the central bank, because it becomes more effective at tightening from monetary policy.
Yeah, if I may just follow up on this one, because I noted that this new data set that you created on the firm's expectations, you actually used it in the both of the chapters in some ways, or at least it was referred in both of these. And I wonder, it was about textual analysis. So is this some kind of new way of how to get kind of, if you don't have numbers, you get some new text-related indicators? Yeah.
So this technique is just so looks at all the transcripts. So it's a very large database. For some countries, it's a very large database. And look at we use actually GPT to figure out what are the words that are more associated with inflation expectations. So GPT tells us a list of words that we should be looking at. And with this list of words, we then go to all the transcripts, like going back to the 1999 to today, how many times companies have used these words, either in their transcripts or when they're responding to questions. So the number of times they mention these words is really what it drives our inflation expectations. If they're talking a lot about it, it's because they're worried, and that indicates that they're actually expecting inflation to go up in the future. So that's the idea of that.
Yeah, thanks. Now I remember, because in your case it was about geopolitics. That was the word. Or yeah. Anybody else? If not, we thank Allan. Okay, Peter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we in Europe have been addicted for about a decade of all those five-year things, which are the market expectations, which seem to be very highly correlated with very recent dynamics of the oil prices. So what is worrisome, I don't know how it's reflected in your model, but if there is a high correlation in between short or to medium-term expectations and longer-term expectations, then skipping all the econometrics in terms of issues which creates, would it be a kind of combined and even more dangerous impact for the inflation itself if there is a kind of increasing correlation in between short-term and longer-term inflation expectations?
Yeah, so it's not in the chapter because we can only have 20 pages, so we have to choose what we put in the chapter. But we actually did an exercise that suppose that then people their long-term inflation expectations is higher, right? In this case, we show that it is a lot more costly for central banks so also would increase the cost, and it's about 1% of GDP more, if you think about the sacrifice ratio, to bring inflation back to target, if long-term inflation expectations are 1% higher than the target. So it is, of course, if we do have, even though we have that long-term inflation expectations does not explain a lot of inflation, having long-term inflation expectations not anchored at the target increases the cost of bringing inflation back to target.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Allan.
Thank you.
And maybe I will then ask Jorge to come and present the next presentation about the commodity markets and fragmentation. Very topical indeed, as was the monetary policy. So, please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction, and for organizing. So I'm going to present the other analytical chapter. For those of you who are not fully familiar with the WIO usually comes in 3 or 4 chapters every 6 months. The first chapter is the one with the global projections, and the other 2 have delve on a normally conjunctural analytical topics. So Allan just presented the one on inflation expectations. And the one that I'm going to present today is one on fragmentation and commodity markets. It is a chapter that tries to identify the pockets of vulnerability among the commodity space and potential risks from a macro perspective. This particular chapter, as you see in the names below, it's quite a team effort from different teams with different analytical approaches and different models used to tackle this issue. As a result, each of those analytical pieces and each of these models will merit their own individual presentation and their own individual paper. What I'm going to try to do today is basically give a summary of the main insights and messages that come from the different pieces of analysis and give you a flavor of what analytical tools we're using. But for those of you that are really into the details of and want to know more about the details on the different models used, I encourage you to go and download not only the chapter, but there's a very detailed online annex and associated working papers that are coming with this chapter. So why are we interested in this topic? Well, first of all, our membership is interested. Economic fragmentation has been identified as a risk. But it's not only about policymakers that the concerns are arising, it's also among firms. So as we were recently discussing, one of the tools that we're introducing in both of the chapters is this approach of trying to identify different code words and the frequency of different words associated to topics in earnings calls using text analysis. And in this chart, what you can see is the frequency with which words associated with geoeconomic fragmentation are appearing in earnings calls. The red line shows the one for in the commodity sector space, while the blue one it shows across all companies. And you can see this spike that started really with the war in Ukraine, but that has continued even in 2023. And this spike is more pronounced among commodities than overall, and has endured even if other measures of geopolitical risk, such as the one shown in the yellow line, have declined. So this is a prominent, seems to be a prominent story and risk that has some prevalence among firms, how firms are thinking about things. In this chapter, we try to address 5 questions. The first one is, why should we be concerned about commodity markets? And we're going to argue that one of the reasons we should be concerned is that commodity markets tend to be highly geographically concentrated. And this is largely due because of the prominence of natural endowments. Natural endowments are particularly important for commodities. That makes them geographically concentrated and therefore more vulnerable to disruptions in trade flows across countries and regions. The second question is, are there signs of rising fragmentation in primary commodity markets? And we're going to argue that the answer is yes, using both de jure and de facto evidence. The third question is, which commodities are most vulnerable to geoeconomic fragmentation? And there we're going to find that particular minerals and selected agricultural goods are more vulnerable, quite more vulnerable than some of the energy commodities that are usually more talked about. And in that list of most vulnerable commodities, several of the key metals that are necessary for the green transition will flag kind of red in our vulnerability measures. The fourth question is, what are the potential economic impacts from commodity market fragmentation? And then we're going to find relatively modest GDP impact, particularly at the global level. But there is a lot of cross-country heterogeneity, and there are some results that we're going to talk about implications for future price volatility. Finally, we're going to, partially motivated by the empirical results and the modeling results that we get, quite concerning around commodities that are key for the green transition, we're going to try to analyze through the lens of the model what are the implications for the green transition, and we're going to find that the green transition will be significantly costlier and therefore might be delayed should fragmentation be an issue in commodity markets in the future. In terms of the scope and research design of the chapter, so we're going to focus on 48 commodities. This includes energy commodities, think crude oil, natural gas, oil, crude oil, natural gas, coal, also several agricultural commodities and minerals. And the commodities that we select are based, first of all, on data availability, but we're selecting and focusing on the commodities that are either among the most largely traded commodities in each of these energy, agriculture, and minerals categories, or if they have been identified as critical for the green transition or key technologies by either the EU or the US. In terms of research design, as I was saying, we combine a mix of empirical tools as well as several different models, and we conduct several types of simulation. And at this point, it's perhaps useful to clarify what we mean by fragmentation. And we want to focus on any policy-driven reversal of trade integration. So trade integration can move or can be reversed because of a variety of reasons. It can be because of technological changes, for example, or changes even in trading costs. We're going to focus on policy-driven reversals of integration. And also want to highlight, before I start showing you results, that in the simulations that I'm going to show you, I'm going to focus on a very hypothetical and very highly stylized, even a realistic scenario where the world fragments along two blocks using the UN vote on Ukraine in 2022 as a benchmark. In the chapter, we conduct other exercises with alternative block configurations and fragmentation scenarios. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the effects of switching individual countries. But the idea is to use this very stylized simulation to, first of all, illustrate the main mechanisms at work, and also try to find which are the pockets of vulnerability in the system across the commodity space. And please feel free to interrupt me if we have questions along the way. Otherwise, we can have questions afterwards. So let me go to the first question, which is what makes commodities different to other goods and perhaps more vulnerable to geoeconomic fragmentation scenarios. Well, as I was saying, first of all, they're very highly geographically concentrated. On the left chart here, you can see the share of overall production that is dominated by the top 3 countries in the world. This is the average across agricultural commodities, across energy commodities. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to distinguish mined minerals markets from refined minerals markets because they show very different patterns, which will be important to understanding vulnerabilities to economic fragmentation. And you can see here that the top 3 countries tend to dominate at least half of global production for the average commodity across the categories. So it's very highly concentrated production. If we focus on particular markets, if you look at the soybean market, for example, you see that Brazil alone produces 34% of soybeans in the world, the US 29%, and Argentina 16%. So those 3 account for most of the global production. Another very interesting example is one for copper. So if you look at the mined copper, this is the rock that comes out of the mountain. Chile produces 28% of the mined copper in the world, Peru 12%, and China 8%. So between Chile and Peru, they have about 40% of the market. But when you look at the refined part of that copper market, it looks very different. There, China produces actually 40% of the copper of the world. The reason I'm highlighting this because this pattern is reflecting in other metals as well, and other minerals as well. The world is structured in a way where the mined rocks are taken out from countries that are usually voting along the lines of the US or Europe, shipped to China for refining, and then that refined product is either shipped back again or turned into other products, other manufacturing products downstream, and then shipped again. And you can see in that configuration, how the configuration can be very vulnerable to disruptions should trade between China in this case and the US South American bloc would be disrupted, because it will be disrupted both the mined flows as well as the refined flows as well. Because of the role of natural endowments and production is highly concentrated, but because demand is actually geographically dispersed, it turns out to be the case that commodities are highly traded. So what I'm showing you in the middle chart here is a distribution across commodities of the share of world production that is actually traded. And you can see that for agricultural commodities and energy commodities, about 30% of world output, a little bit more. And then for the mined minerals and minerals refined, it tends to be about the median across commodities tends to be about 50%. This is well above the share of global output traded, which tends to be, well, depending on how you measure it, 20–25%. So this also makes it highly vulnerable to fragmentation. And the other reason is because of the limited capacity to adapt given changes in prices. So the right chart is showing you the distribution of demand elasticities and supply elasticities across commodities, both in the short run and the long run. And the point here is that commodity markets, both on the demand side as well as the supply side, tend to be inelastic. This also makes it more vulnerable then to fragmentation scenarios, as it is not that easy to adapt both supply capacity or to substitute away from commodities in many cases, at least compared to other goods. Not only is our commodities concentrated in terms of production, but also in terms of when you look at imports. So the left chart shows the share of countries that import only from 1, 2, or 3 suppliers. And you can see that, especially for the minerals, over 50% of countries tend to import for less than 3 suppliers. So even though that theoretically you could, let's say, you get fragmented from another country, you could theoretically just substitute away from that exporter that you're importing from. That might not be that easy to do in practice, particularly if you were highly dependent on that one particular supplier. And you saw some of these dynamics already and some of these difficulties, I think, with the war in Ukraine. We also highlight in the chapter the vulnerability to food insecurity and to agricultural imports that is present among low-income countries. So the right chart is showing you the case of wheat, but this story resonates across other commodity markets in the agricultural space, where the share of annual consumption that is actually that the low-income countries need to import is quite high. So around 80% for the case of wheat is much lower for advanced economies. And at the same time, the capacity for domestic storage is more limited in low-income countries. So we're going to find from the other exercise and the modeling exercises that I'm going to show you later, then low-income countries will be more vulnerable through this agricultural commodity channel, and at the same time will have a more limited capacity to adapt. And this raises some food security concerns in the event of fragmentation. So let me go to the next question, which is, are there any signs of rising fragmentation? So we look at a variety of both de jure and de facto measures in the chapter. On the left, I'm looking at a de jure measure, which is the number of trade interventions by sector. The bars are showing the number of new trade interventions that appear every year in the commodity space, and the black line is showing you the one for all goods. And a couple of points here is that we saw this rise in trade interventions even before the war in Ukraine started. And we also see some slowing of trade flows and some slowing on FDI investment as well, which we document in the chapter I'm going to show you here. And when you look at compare what happened in the commodity space against other goods, you see that the increase in this measure is quite more pronounced in the commodity space. This is consistent with historical experience where there has been other episodes where commodities tend to be the first set of goods that are normally targeted by geopolitical, induced by geopolitical tensions. So we also can see a little bit of evidence from potential fragmentation commodity markets from de facto measures, and this one is showing you the price dispersion across different markets for different commodity markets. So commodities are traded in different markets because commodities tend to be relatively homogeneous good. After accounting for different trade costs, they should be trading around the same price, at least at roughly constant markups. And you see these fluctuations in the price dispersions in coal, but also in crude oil, lithium, wind, and phosphate markets. Different prices arise in different markets. They have not been that permanent, since the shocks have not been that permanent, but this dispersion in prices, it's an important mechanism through which fragmentation operates, as we will see later, and there seems to be some evidence of that has occurred in recent years. So now let me try to introduce a framework to try to start identifying across the commodities which commodities might be most vulnerable to fragmentation. I'm going to start by describing a very, very simple kind of Econ 101 framework, and then we're going to go into more complex models later. So think about this very simple model of the world where there is a single commodity and the price, PW, is determined by the intersection of world supply and demand curves. Okay? And this world market is really a mix of two different economies. We'll call it two different blocks. Block A on the left and Block B on the right. And they have their own supply and demand curves that determine their, that are associated with their own producers and consumers. At the beginning, let's say the world is integrated. So these world supply and world demand curves determine the price. These lines are really the sum of the individual supply and demand curves from the different regions of the world. And in this specific case, at the world price, this block A is supplying more than is demanded, so it's exporting the commodity to block B, which is importing it. So very, very simple Econ 101 mechanics. What would happen in this very simple example if we were to fragment the world, where then PW will no longer be the equilibrium price? What you would see will be a rise in the price dispersion across the block A and block B commodities. In block A, the price would drop from PW to PA. That is, the price will now be determined by the local supply and local demand curves, and the price will go down. So the previously exporting block will experience a price decline. On the right, the opposite would happen. The previously importing country would experience a price rise. So even in this very simple setup, you can see how fragmentation can lead to different prices, different markets, or at least changing price dispersion across the markets. And you can also see that the magnitude of that price rise or decline will depend on two things. First, the magnitude of the imbalance that exists in a particular block, how much the block was exporting or importing. And two, on the shape of the demand and supply curves. The more vertical they are, the greater the price response. That is, the more inelastic they are, the less the capability to adapt to changing prices, the more the price change that you will experience. So using this very simple framework, we're going to do the very illustrative, highly stylized scenario that I was talking about before, where you fragment the world into the blue part and the red part. The blue part I'm going to call the US-Europe plus block. The red part I'm going to call the China-Russia plus block. Again, just for illustrative purposes. But even then, when you start fragmenting the world in that way, you can notice a little bit of a pattern which is pretty consistent. You can see this pattern where the US-Europe plus block tends to be the one exporting to the agricultural goods, to the China-Russia block. The China-Russia block imports. The energy markets tend to be balanced across most of these configurations. It just happens to be the case that given the current production configuration across geographies, on the feasible based on votes configuration, that tends to be the case. But in the minerals, you get these large imbalances that go different ways depending whether you look at the mined part of the market or the refined part of the market. For the mined part of the market, it tends to be the case, as I was saying, that the blue block, that's a US-Europe plus block, tend to export the raw minerals into mostly China, but the red block is at all. And then they import the refined versions of the minerals. So this is why we make this distinction. So what I'm going to show you next is I'm going to start with a world where everything is integrated with single prices. I think we have a question. Yeah.
Nicholas Ragel, Bank of Estonia.
Yeah.
This sounds slightly counterintuitive because I think China has a monopoly on this kind of rare earth, and they mine those rare earths and then they ship it to other countries for refinement. But you explained it the other way around, that China or the red block is importing the raw materials, the mined raw materials, and then these countries refine them and then ship them back to the blue block. So that's, for me, kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, so that's true for the raw earth, which are a tiny part of overall trade in the category of mined minerals. But what you're saying, the pattern you're saying is true for the very rare earth minerals, which are actually a very small share of the overall trade in the category.
What's the main part?
Things like copper, aluminum, iron.
So what comes out of Australia and goes into China?
Yeah, I'll show you. We'll get into more into those patterns. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you next is I'm going to start with an integrated world, one price. I'm going to split the world into two, and I'm going to see what happens to the prices. And I'm going to show you that the distribution of the price changes that you observe across the commodity categories. So this is what you get. So again, this is the price change that you would get from fragmenting the world into two across the commodities. And as we talked about before, the price effect will be different depending on which block you are. So in blue are the distribution of price effects on the US Europe plus blocks. In red is the distribution of price changes in the China Russia plus block. And we are dividing these effects by commodity category. So these are the agricultural commodities, these are energy categories, minerals mined, minerals refined. So a few observations that you can make from this chart. First, the red bars in the mine category are quite high. This means the China-Russia block is more vulnerable than the other block in terms, at least more vulnerable to pricing spikes in the minerals mine market. And the intuition is the one that I was trying to introduce from before. They just import a lot of these mined versions of the materials. And when you look at the distribution across commodities, of course, there's a lot of variation depending on which metal you look at, and the ones you were talking about are more below zero for this distribution for China and Russia. When you rank actually all of the commodities in our sample, and you ask, for which one can I get the largest pricing spike from fragmenting the world into two, the ones that come at the top are palm oil and soybeans in agriculture, but in the metals is cobalt, copper, lithium, and nickel. And these are exactly the four commodities that have been identified, the four metals that are key for the green transition because of their role in batteries, electric vehicles, and electrification overall. So this is where our concern about the green transition comes from. It's just, this comes from the data, they flash red, basically. In the refined, the story is a little bit backwards. So now the blue bars are higher just because the US-Europe block is higher. Notice that the energy commodities are kind of bunched here. It does not mean that they're not vulnerable at all to geoeconomic fragmentation. It's just that they tend to be relatively more balanced, and when you interact that with the elasticities of supply and demand they have, it's hard to get the magnitude of price changes that you'll get in the other much more highly concentrated markets. Of course, let me say just first that, of course, the magnitude of these price changes changes depending on how you draw the lines and how you form the different blocks. And to try to highlight the role, how sensitive those alignments and the effects are, depending on how you classify different countries, what we do is we ask the question, okay, let's get every single commodity market in the world and now ask what is the largest possible price change that you can induce by just switching the classification of an individual country. And that will tell us how vulnerable that commodity market is to that particular, the switch in alignment for that particular country. That will be it's another measure of vulnerability to geopolitical fragmentation. So this is what we get from that exercise. So again, this for the US Euro Plus block on the left, and this is the largest price increase that you can get for each mineral markets ranked by the top effects that you can get from just removing an exporter from that individual block. And what do you find? Well, at the top of the list is one of our four green transition metals, cobalt. And you get a price spike that just reaches way beyond the chart, which is capped at 500%, if you were to reclassify the Democratic Republic of Congo. And why is that? Well, it just happens to be the case that the Democratic Republic of Congo produces about 70% of the world's cobalt. So when we speak about cobalt, depending on how we aligned Congo one side or the other, that has drastic implications for prices. Going down the list, the second one is cocoa, is the second most sensitive, vulnerable market to these realignments. And this is because there are particular countries in West Africa, and this Cote d'Ivoire is producing this spike, that just produce between them about 2/3 of the world cocoa, and therefore cocoa tends to be a very vulnerable market depending on the classification of those countries. One point that we make, beyond being interested in particular in cobalt and cocoa markets, is that for many markets, relatively small economies can have very large implications of global commodity prices for many of these commodities. Australia is one that appears actually several times. I'm not showing it here in this top price effects, because Australia is one of the key exporters of raw materials in the US Euro Plus block here. And even though maybe it's hard to envision changes in alignment for Australia, if there were other ways to disrupt the trade flows, so the maritime routes between Australia and these other regions, that will have probably similar effects through the similar channels, and there's particular markets that are quite sensitive to it. One of the more macro-relevant ones is iron ore, which is one of the most traded ones. Looking at the China-Russia bloc, cocoa also appears at the top, with Cameroon being the switcher. But one key country from this particular illustrative classification is South Africa. South Africa is also a major player in a lot of these mined markets, and they tend to ship across the world and to China as well. Again, if the maritime routes were somehow distorted, of trade costs would change, it would act through the channels, maybe different magnitudes, but you can see the vulnerabilities that are present in that part of the commodity space. So one of the points we make is that this has implication for volatility. From the previous exercise in geopolitical alignment, it might be that there are no full changes or full fragmentation of the world, but changes in news about perceived potential changes in how a country aligns with one another might induce volatility themselves. An overall fragmented world means a world with smaller markets, and smaller markets tend to be more fragile to particular to any kind of shocks. Just to illustrate that point here, the left chart shows what the price effect that a 3 standard deviation shock in the U.S. wheat harvest would have on wheat prices under an integrated world versus a fragmented world, and basically you get double the price effect from the same supply shock, from the same bad harvest, just because there's a smaller market. This is just to introduce the point that smaller markets are more sensitive, and therefore price volatility might increase just because of a smaller markets world. Now, so far I've talked about vulnerabilities in terms of potential price impacts and price vulnerabilities of different commodity markets. Now let me go into the more macro question, which is which commodities actually are a pocket of vulnerability to the broader economic system, to the global economy? Which one can induce largest macroeconomic effects? And that's a hard question to solve, one for which we need a model. So our approach is to study this question through 3 different types of models. They have pros and cons between them. The first one is a very simple single commodity model that I was showing you before. Using these very simple supply and demand curves, we can calculate changes in producer surplus, changes in consumer surplus, changes in total surplus, and try to get a sense of which are the commodities that actually matter from a macroeconomic perspective. Now, the disadvantage of this framework is that we can only really talk about fragmenting one single commodity market at once, not about simultaneously fragmenting multiple commodity markets. For that, we need a richer model. So we're using a full trade model. For those of you that are familiar with the literature, it's a Galindo-Paro style model. I'll just describe it in a bit. And that allows us to fragment multiple commodity markets at once and see what happens to different countries. The limitation of this model is that it's really static in nature. We can only talk about steady state impacts. We cannot really talk about transitional dynamics. For that, we need a dynamic model. So what we do is also we use our own in-house DSG, a dynamic sectarial equilibrium model, called the Global Macroeconomic Model for the Energy Transition. This will allow us to talk about the dynamic effects from geoeconomic fragmentation. So let me first show you the results from the very simple single commodity model that we were using before. Here, instead of the distribution of price changes, I'm showing you the distribution of total surplus changes that occur from fragmenting different commodity markets. A few points to point out. First, when you look at the total surplus losses in the China-Russia plus block, then they tend to be higher, both in agriculture, in energy, in mine minerals. And this is because, again, it's not only the fact that they're more exposed in a great majority of the commodity space, but they're also more exposed in macroeconomically relevant commodities. Therefore, they experience larger losses when you fragment different commodity markets. The second one is that among the larger changes that actually now occur in the energy space. So when we talked about energy commodities before, I was telling you energy commodities are not as vulnerable as other commodities to fragmentation, but because they are very largely traded, they're very macro relevant, then the multiplication between a moderate effect and being very macro relevant induces kind of potential large changes. Although if you see the magnitude of the changes that I'm showing you here, and this is the total surplus changes as a percent of GNE, gross national expenditure, all of them are below 0.05. So these are mostly small changes. Now there are a few outliers labeled here: palm oil and soybeans in the China-Russia bloc, iron ore in the US-Europe plus bloc, because of the reliance on Australia, and copper, iron ore, and cobalt. Again, copper and cobalt are two green transition metals that are not only among the most price vulnerable to fragmentation, but also they are more the most significant pockets of vulnerability, especially to the China-Russia, for the China-Russia plus bloc. Now, these are small effects overall, and these are the overall effects on the global bloc, but they hide a lot of heterogeneity across countries. In particular, it obscures the large effects that you can get from fragmenting a single commodity on the top exporters of that commodity. So to shed light on this issue, the right chart is focusing on particular markets and showing you what happens to the top exporters in that market. I'm going to concentrate on the copper example first. So in this example, the top exporters in the US-Europe plus bloc is Peru and Chile. And what happens to them is they actually experience quite significant decreases in total surplus. These are actually macroeconomically meaningful. About 5% for Chile, and for Peru, and 2.5% of Chile. In their case, they benefit from being integrated in a global market. They normally export a lot to China, where if that doesn't happen anymore, they would experience lower prices in their trading region, and that induces large losses in total surplus. The opposite effect of that you get in countries like Mongolia or Kazakhstan, which are exporters in a previously imported region. Should the world fragment into two, in these examples, they would actually be able to face higher prices, export their output to China. They will gain quite a bit from that fragmentation. So these overall moderate impacts that we're going to get also in the next simulation, you have to be mindful that these obscure quite large impacts that you can get from individual countries. So let me now go into a little bit of a more realistic exercise where we fragment multiple commodities at once. For this, as I was saying, we use a multi-country, multi-sector general equilibrium model with its production functions. This is developed by colleagues at the IMF, both Ken and Ket. As I was saying, for those of you that are into the trade literature, this is a Caliendo-Paro style model. So commodities are used as inputs, and they form into intermediate inputs and into final goods that have a roundabout production structure. And this model is we're able to use data from the input-output structure of the economy, not only within the commodity space, but across different sectors to kind of study the simultaneous fragmentation. A few parameters are key for the model. This is the elasticities of commodities, both the demand elasticity and the trade elasticity. So we basically calibrate a low demand elasticity for commodities, 0.2 versus 1 for other sectors, and a relatively low trade elasticity for commodities as well. We calibrate the model using 133 commodities in this case, 24 other sectors, 145 countries. So the idea is that this provides much more richness about the interconnectedness across sectors and across different countries. But I'm only able to show you kind of steady state results. And of course, there's some simplifying assumptions that need to be made to compute the model. Let me show you the results. What do we get? So at the global level, we get an output loss of about a little bit over 0.3% in the total output loss. That's deviation from baseline. Again, this is we interpret this to be relatively moderate. So even our very highly stylized, quite extreme scenario where we fragment the world into two and not commodities trades happens, the effect that you get is we view it as relatively modest, with large differences between the US and China. And this is because of the channels we talked about before, just the difference of exposure between the different blocks. We look under the hood of what happens to different countries. What we find is the low-income countries tend to be much more vulnerable and experience greater losses than the middle and advanced countries. And when we try to decompose where that effect is coming from, that effect is coming mostly from the agricultural commodities. So even though I told you that agricultural commodities were not among the most sensitive, and were not particularly the most macro relevant from a global perspective, they really matter for low-income countries, not only from their macroeconomies, but also to feed their population. This is where the food insecurity concerns come from. So in terms of dynamics, we need to go into the dynamic model. This is a multi-region, multi-sector DSG, and the DSG framework allows us to introduce a large set of nominal and real rigidities. Compared to previous versions of the model that we have used in previous publications of fragmentation, this has been expanded to include production, consumption, trade of fossil fuels and renewable energy. And we have modified it to include crude oil, coal, natural gas, copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, which are the green transition commodities. One of the things that we have to sacrifice when we go into the dynamic setting is that we have to limit the amount of commodities that we study, but also we need to limit the amounts of economies that we can model. So we have to aggregate the world into regions. So for this exercise, we use the US, it's one economy, Europe is another economy, and then we have the group of countries that were leaning US or Europe based on the classification before. China is another economy, Russia is another economy, and then the countries leaning towards China or Russia. So just to briefly describe the setup, in this setup, households consume goods, energy, transportation, and leisure. Firms produce tradables, non-tradables, renewable energy structures. This is the infrastructure to produce either renewable energy or fossil fuel-based energy, and vehicles, both EVs and as well as traditional vehicles. In the model, copper and nickel are used for the production of traditional electric vehicles and tradable, and lithium and cobalt for the production of EVs and tradables because of the role in electrification and in batteries. So with that, with that setup, what we're going to do again is fragment the world into two. And in terms of the main channels at work, I think by now they should seem familiar. You get a price response in the different commodity markets. You'll get some expenditure switching now and trade diversion as the markets get fragmented. And the nice thing about the dynamic setup is that we can talk about the role of rigidities. I'm going to introduce two rigidities in particular. One is on pipelines. We're going to introduce the idea that just because you fragment, you cannot trade with Russia anymore, let's say in between Russia and Europe. It's not like the US can immediately export gas to Europe. There is some cost associated to that because of the role of pipelines. So that kind of story will be present in the model. And the other thing we're going to have is some rigidities in terms of scaling up refining capacity. As we were saying, China is quite a hub for refining minerals in the world. And it's really not realistic to assume that the other parts of the world would immediately be able to scale up refining capacity. Refining capacity normally takes 5 to 10 years to fully scale up, so the model will try to kind of mimic that. So with that infrastructure in effect, let me talk a little bit of how what are the at least qualitative effects from introducing these rigidities. So in terms of gas pipelines, as I was saying, once you fragment, what will happen is that you don't get like this full effect right away from the US increasing exports to Europe. Once you introduce rigidities in the first year in our modeling exercise, the US exports actually fall before actually rebounding by year 5 and just increasing by a lot because they become a major exporter for Europe. In terms of minerals production, again, the overall minerals production, even though that the US-Europe plus bloc now have privileged access to all of the mines and mining products from South America, they are not able to increase production in minerals overall because they cannot scale the refining fast enough. They have a lot of more raw materials now, but they are not able to use it all to actually increase the overall mineral production capacity. And that's kind of the important role that minerals play, that we need a dynamic framework to really analyze it. So with all these ingredients, we put them into the DSG setting. And what do we get? Well, from the world perspective, again, we get a deviation in GDP over the first 3 years of about 0.3. So very similar to the trade model. And when we decompose that global effect, you see that most of it comes from the minerals, from the mineral channel. And again, you have this effect of US-Europe plus bloc being less affected than the China-Russia plus bloc because of the channels we discussed previously. In in terms of inflation, you get an effective inflation about 0.4% positive in year one, so a significant but not incredibly large effect on inflation. When you decompose where that is coming from, it's coming from the energy commodities, particularly natural gas. So the world economy appears to be more vulnerable to minerals, but in terms of inflation, that's where the energy commodities kind of seem to matter a little bit more. So that's one of the insights that is coming from this setup. So with that, let me just get to the last question, which is what are the implications for the clean energy transition? So first of all, let me highlight that according to the International Energy Agency, in order to fulfill the net zero emission scenarios, the commodity demand will have to increase spectacularly. So according to the projections of how much more minerals we would need to fulfill those targets, you get that you would need by 2030 about 50% more copper than you have today, about double the nickel, double the cobalt, and 6 times the lithium that you produce today. So it's quite a daunting task, I would say. At the same time, when you look at the distribution of these minerals, they're highly concentrated, as we discussed in particular countries, and highly vulnerable to fragmentation scenarios. So the question we ask is, okay, well, let's mix these two things. What are the implications for the green energy transition through the lens of the dynamic model that tries to account for the different channels across the main channels to which commodities are related to the green transition? And what do we get? Well, because of the projected increased demand from the green transition, of course, the price of these critical minerals would suffer upward pressures along that net zero transition path, and the prices would increase more in the China-Russia plus block when markets are fragmented because of the distribution of production that is currently at place. In terms of investment in renewables, you get significant, like about 40% less investment in renewables for the China-Russia plus block, which means about 20% less at a global level, and also a lower global production of electric vehicles. One of the main messages and insights that come from this analysis is that it's important to view at policies at the green transition from a global perspective, since maybe there are policies that are motivated to fulfill more domestic, let's say Europe-based or US-based green transition targets, but these have implications for the other part of the world. And since global emissions are global, what matters is really the gray bar. In the case of fragmentation, it turns out to be the case that it's particularly bad for China-Russia plus block, but it's actually negative in terms of investment renewables in both blocks. And this is why we say that the effect will probably be, in the event of continued geopolitical tensions and a more fragmented world, of a little bit more costly and maybe delayed transition. So let me just summarize. So what have we learned, hopefully? First, concentration in natural endowments makes commodities very vulnerable to fragmentation. There are also signs of rising fragmentation that even predated the war in Ukraine, but they have spiked because of the war in Ukraine. There's vulnerabilities to fragmentation, particularly in minerals that are key to the green transition, and also certain agricultural goods, which raise food insecurity risks. In terms of the long-term global macroeconomic impacts, they appear to be actually modest, but there's a lot of cross-country heterogeneity, so depending on which commodity markets might be more or less affected, you can see macroeconomically relevant effects in different countries. Also, a more fragmented world, it will probably be a more price volatile world because of the mechanisms we described, and with more food insecurity risks. As we said, commodity market fragmentation would probably delay the green transition. In terms of the policy messages from the chapter makes it clear that the world as it currently is a quite integrated place, especially in the commodity, when you analyze commodities, and especially when you analyze the commodities that are relevant for the green transition. Therefore, preserving the multilateral cooperation arrangements and institutions is by far the first best. But we also discuss some second best policies, and the chapter argues that perhaps establishing a green corridor for critical materials for the energy transition, and potentially a food corridor for selective agricultural commodities, it might be one way where we can possibly go forward, an agreement that covers a minimum list of commodities in these two categories that is preserved for the global objective of decreasing global emissions. The chapter also called for improving international sharing and standardization of data on critical minerals. So you asked about critical minerals before. We made a lot of effort in collecting and standardizing data for this project, and you realize that there is a lot of dark spots. A lot of these commodity markets are actually they are not really fully covered. We don't really have the full picture. The data is not available in some of them, and for the ones that it's available, it's not really easy to standardize and match, for example, trade flows with production flows. So that's I think a lot of work to do there. I think one of the reasons why the energy commodities are that much talked about in relation to geopolitical tensions is because it's a largely follow market with a lot of data. I think these points on these metals and critical minerals, I think are rather, they were new to us during the project, and I think has been new to several people that we have presented this to. The chapter also has some potential recommendations for how countries can adapt to the risk of fragmentation. This includes fostering production, trade integration, and efficient use. On the diversification of supply sources, this can be an alternative, but it has its costs, so those need to be kept in mind. And there's also a call to enhance preparedness systems against future supply shocks and price shocks overall. This is particularly important in low-income countries where if we are facing a world that we're higher geopolitical tensions, and that probably means higher price volatility, and that means being ready to future price movements. And with that, I would like to thank you, and please, if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jorge. I don't know if anybody dares to have a question. Yeah, Lena.
Your policy recommendations start from the opposite side where the problem starts from. Countries do disintegrate because they want to, and now to have an impact on the others, negative impact on the others. That's why we have two blocks, right? They're both export and import restrictions imposed voluntarily in order to make the point. And now you're saying that you need to establish green corridors. That does not make sense.
Yeah. So one of the points in the chapter and in all of the models. So I never said that it's advantageous to a country to impose them. And actually, when in all of the models, the mechanics are present, so that if you look at the distribution of surplus changes across the blocks, all of them are below zero. So the world is not like a block gains.
That is the point. That is the point. The countries do impose sanctions in order to make a point. It's not in GDP growth numbers. It's another point, right?
And so this chapter, I guess as an economist and trying to analyze this, I think our role is not to analyze all the potential motivations from sanctions, which there may be many, but document the trade-offs and the economic costs on which we can talk about. And the point here is that there are economic losses. So what are the potential dynamics that will happen? How future sanctions might or might not occur? That's really beyond what we can speak of as economists, I would say. But just document the cost and the implications of those actions. Yeah.
Yes, that's why I'm saying that the conclusion is political. It's about the green trade lines that you're suggesting in order to avoid economic effects, but the first point of having this is having economic effects. So that's why I'm saying that you are taking a political stance. They're not taking a completely economic analysis, because the conclusions, not about the analysis, that is fine.
So I would say that I think I would agree that the policy recommendations take as an underlying assumption that you want to fulfill the net zero emission scenario. If you want to fulfill and you want a green transition to occur, and you want to minimize the cost of that green transition, then the analysis concludes that this is a way forward. Whether or not the original motivation is valid or not, that's obviously beyond the scope.
And if I may also answer Lenno, then we actually very much want that the IMF, or at least somebody, actually discusses and analyzes what it actually costs economically. So, yeah, Nicholas.
I wanted to ask about this price dispersion of coal. Can you elaborate where that comes from? I mean, I think we understand where price dispersion in oil comes from.
Yeah.
But where does price dispersion in coal comes from?
The one in the data. Yeah. So I'm not an expert in coal markets. Let me get to that slide. So this, I can just give you the mechanical answer, which is what I'm showing here. In this slide is the difference between the maximum and minimum price across the different coal markets for which we have data. That's what that is. Now, if you see the timing of the spike coincides with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but so that's as far as we can go and tell in the data. Then there are, I think, when you look at a particular commodity market, there's always like plausible alternative explanations, but I think it's particularly rough. And when you look at distribution of coal, from what I remember, it tends to be one of the ones where it's a little bit more unbalanced. But yeah.
That's one question. The other question is, some of these commodities are subject to behavior of certain monopolistic players, like the OPEC, right? So here you fragment between different blocks, but within the OPEC, there's also a certain split. Who aligns with whom? Have you taken that into account, or can this be taken into account?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think, so let me make a couple of points that I think are important to make. One is that if you look at the history of commodities of the past 70 years, they have actually been different attempts to form OPEC-type cartels, and many of them actually have not lasted long. And even OPEC itself, at the beginning, it turned out to be the case that multiple attempts to fragment the markets and to get that power kind of eroded quickly, because there's always an incentive to kind of go around restrictions. So even in the height of the Cold War, there was trade between the different regions of the world. And so there are 2 points to make. One is that it is very hard actually to fully fragment markets in the way we try to illustrate here. Even when you do this exaggerated exercise, modest, the global GDP impacts are actually moderate, and it historically has been very hard to implement a full fragmentation. So we're getting moderate global effects even from an extreme scenario on which actually the historical experience says there are multiple reasons why it is very hard for that kind of sharp effect to happen, just because there's an incentive for everybody else to go around any type of restriction. And I think we have even seen some of that in this episode as well. In terms of market power, we looked at the question of market power. We only have data from the country concentration perspective. And basically you do see that most of these markets after fragmentation would see a rise in the concentration of many of these markets, giving rise to increased market power, maybe producing an additional effect of the price markups. There's some, now the inclusion, from an academic perspective, the inclusion of markups in trade models actually at the edge of the frontier. So we have a team of economists that are following up on that and trying to incorporate the role of markups and see what the implication for fragmentation are markups and how firms with higher markups would respond and things like that. But yeah, that's as far as we went, yeah.
Yeah, I would also come closer to home, and I know that you just came from Bank of Finland to present the same research, and I know that Bank of Finland is really working on this trade fragmentation. It's like a research project, and as far as I know about their project, they have also concluded that on top of what you say, that the low-income countries are particularly vulnerable, also the small open economies are very vulnerable for the trade fragmentation because you are so open to trade. So I don't know if you have anything, what you have kind of considered in this research or just later, what you think about this, about the small open economies?
Yeah, no, I think what the things from them that I read are very much not out of line. They don't look at the commodity space in particular, but the wider question. And first of all, let me say that we look at particularly the commodities angle in this particular chapter, but this is part of a longer series of pieces that the IMF has launched on the topic of geoeconomic fragmentation. There was one through the FDI angle. There has been others through the trade angle. I think the trade angle has been probably the most covered by the academic and policy literature. And yes, indeed, the more open you are, the more vulnerable you are. But even in the exercises, that not only fragment commodities as we do here, but they fragment all trade between large economic zones, that because of the same mechanisms that are playing all of these models, they tend to find effects that I would describe as generally moderate. And the reason is because even if you, let's say, rely a lot on microchips from a particular country, for example, to build cars, the price response tends to be so large that induces substitution behavior along the production line and also along the consumption. And when you play with any of the models that we economists have to analyze these questions, you actually, to get large effects from these types of fragmentation, you actually have to make quite extreme calibration assumptions to get that. And it seems to be a robust result that it's because of the same kind of mechanisms, even in small open economies, the effects from fragmentation, not autarky from the world, which is different, but fragmentation of large economic zones tends to be relatively moderate because of the same channels. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you, very useful presentation. I was thinking about a little bit beyond the green transition. Let's assume that somehow, perhaps a little bit delayed, but still we can manage to get net zero emissions. The economic impact can be visible, but doesn't compare with global financial crisis most likely. But is it so that after this green transition, if it's succeeded and we all drive possibly electric cars and stuff like that, we have accidentally swapped ourselves with relatively diversified oil suppliers with highly concentrated lithium and other stuff suppliers, and it means that there may be positive effects on the oil price, but completely different effects on the battery ingredients, which means that it becomes economically optimal actually to reverse the green transition the minute when it happens.
I think your question speaks about the mechanisms that we expect that would happen to implement that. So, in terms of, for example, in the modeling, right? We model an increase in demand that is driven we actually use subsidies to stimulate that demand. And yes, the implication is you saw the projections from the International Energy Agency. I mean, the increases in demand on these minerals is just, the order of magnitude is quite shocking. Therefore, an increase in prices, especially in the relative price between copper and cobalt and these minerals and the energy resources, if you are really subsidizing away, you would expect the relative price to change and for one to become cheaper than the other, unless a policy is made to make that more expensive. So it really depends on what. So I would say to induce a change, you need to change either the relative price or induce a subsidy direct. That has implications on the incentive. So what we're doing here, we're trying to implement a policy in the model that is consistent with that goal. And we are finding we need to then induce these large changes in prices that induce that is the consistent price path that is consistent with that policy. But that does not say anything about the desirability of the outcome. First, you decide the desirable outcome and what is the mechanism to implement it, and that has some impact on prices. In this exercise, we are assuming that the desirable outcome is a net zero emission price. And then we are using a policy tool, which is isomorphic to many potential policy tools, which is a subsidy to achieve that, and that has some implications on prices. And I think that logic will be there. Yes. Yeah.
This is, of course, an extended discussion, but as you said yourself, the teams at the IMF are working on fragmentation in other areas like intermediate inputs or machinery, and you look at fragmentation in the commodity sphere. However, those two things, of course, relate to each other and interchange, right? So when we say, okay, we have fragmentation, for example, in the chip production with Taiwan and China, lithium manufacturing machinery from the Netherlands, this also is affected. Where does the raw materials come from to produce certain computer chips, to produce certain machinery? So I'm wondering if there's some research which kind of analyzes kind of spillover effects or these kind of things, or are you looking at the IMF at those things too?
So to clarify that, so our trade model captures those spillover effects from the commodities. So it captures the fact that if you disrupt the inputs of some metals, then you cannot really produce the cars more cheaply and the other goods more cheaply. It does so through the data on input-output matrix at some level of aggregation because of the type of data, but it does try to capture those spillovers. And even with those spillovers, you get those moderate effects. You can also make the simulation, which other people have done using table models, or just frame it every single trade. So you cannot frame it. You cannot trade not only commodities but all of the goods. And those are the results that I'm referring to when talking about larger effects than this. This is only 0.3. You can get 3%, 5%, maybe a little bit more. But that's the magnitude in terms of deviation. To get beyond that, you have to basically assume. Something close, if we go to Econ 101, to a Liontieff kind of production function. So you make you have to make it hard for the inputs to be substitutable and for the consumption to be substitutable. So in the example of let's say microchips, you need to assume that the microchip really needs that metal and that no microchip can be produced without that, not a single one, basically, or close to that. And then you need to assume that the car really needs to use that microchip and that even if the microchip costs like 5 times more, the car will not be produced. And you need to assume that the consumer will have to consume that car and not something else, even if the car is many times more. But you need these type of extreme assumptions to increase to make the argument that the macroeconomic impact is substantially an order of magnitude larger than that. It just happens to be that the logic is there. And in the case, a more recent case of the Germany example, there was this debate when they cut the gas supplies from basically the gas was cut between Europe and Russia. There was this debate when you saw this spike in gas prices. Basically, there was a camp that said you're going to have these super bad macroeconomic effects. In Germany, you're going to interrupt all the supply line. It was very hard to redirect gas. Gas is indeed one of the ones where there's these restrictions to adapt because it's not that easy to reorient gas flows. And there was the other camp that said, you know what, with LNG and there are other alternatives, people will start substituting away and prices will start to decline, and also the production processes and the consumer processes will adapt, and therefore that will limit the things. There are economists like Ben Moll, for example, at LSE, and others that did some kind of back-on-the-envelope calculations and argued for the second one. I think in retrospect, it seemed that second camp seemed to at least from the data that we have now, the reality seems to be closer to that, and to a degree is because of this substitution mechanism that applies at different types of the supply line from the bottom to the top. Yeah, I don't know, that's, yeah.
I have a related question to this. I wonder how in your models, I mean, one thing is playing with this kind of substitutability and elasticity, but another thing is that, I mean, those sanctions, they have very often, short-term effect. I mean, it's like, if you cut today, of course, I mean, it takes time to, reorient, to find alternative suppliers and stuff like that. So I wonder how in your models you actually also take into account this kind of, that with time, in 5 years, in 10 years, you can substitute most of the things. I mean, it's not like, it's not about the, the microchips are not substitutable. That's not true. I mean, China can do it in 5 to 10 years. I mean, there's no question about it. So how do you account for this kind of effects that over time you actually, the effects of these restrictions will be less and less, even if we completely, fragment the world in two blocks.
Yeah, so I think the mechanical answer is through the calibration of the parameters, and the elasticity of substitution it's an important parameter, but it.
Do you have a time horizon saying that in 10 years everything will be back to, two blocks will be independent?
Yeah, so this assumes that this. Let me make 2 points. First is let me just look at the dynamic effects. So the effects that I show you here, there's a time horizon, deviations of GDP in the first 3 years on the top chart, and then the inflation is the first year. Basically, after I think 7 years in the model, after even 5, but 7 years in the model, everything kind of starts going to path, and 10 years, definitely everything kind of adjusts. Now, this is a permanent shock, so there's still a loss that is permanent because we're assuming that the world never integrates again. To your question, I think these models tend to assume that because you can adjust and things adjust and then everything goes to a new equilibrium that is different from the counterfactual equilibrium had fermentation had not occurred, but that happens. I think that the harder question is to accurately model the transition dynamics, which of the rigidities are relevant, how fast you can change the first 2 years, and then we're flying a little bit more blind. So we make judgment calls on how to model these rigidities, but of course there's a large degree of uncertainty. That being said, because of the mechanism we discussed, you have to make extreme assumptions of those that hardship to make the short-term effects very large. Yeah, that's
That in my view, that doesn't only apply to kind of technologies like microchips. This I believe that China will substitute it very in 5 to 10 years. But also you mentioned the problem with the data on the minerals, because I believe that the gaps that you have in this data are on purpose. Because countries like Russia, for example, and I believe others as well, they hide this data because this is highly price sensitive. If Russia announces now that it has everything, how it affects the prices, right? So that's why the geological data is a national secret. Is a state secret often. So I believe we are open to surprises. And minerals like that, because we can find in 10 years that it's actually, lithium, for example, is one of the widest available, is one of the most available minerals in the world, content, but it's difficult. So it's kind of things are going to be very surprising.
But let me make a point on that, which is and this linked to the raw mineral story, which is you see the current producing countries, but that's different the current potentially producing countries, especially the price movements that we see here. You see from all these models that you can get very large price responses, and then therefore there's some price which new production can kick in. And for some of these materials, especially the ones, some of the raw materials that are only mined in China, it is not the case that the only deposits are in China. Many of them are in the US for several reasons and regulatory reasons of different kinds and environmental concerns, and there are different things. Currently, they are mostly produced in China. That does not mean that needs to be the case, and there are an alternative world with different prices. That is correct. In terms of how that would impact this, that would mean that maybe the supply is more elastic that implies, and that would limit the price responses and the price spikes that we see in those settings. The price response, in my sense, is still can be large because everything that I showed you had to cap it at 500%. Otherwise, some of these mineral price responses mute everything else. But that's kind of it's a good point to keep in mind that we're doing our best to capture the possible supply responses, but it's true we are not accounting for the fact that it is indeed probably the case that there are geological deposits that are probably mineable somewhere else. Yeah.
Nicholas is holding the mic. No. If we do not have any more questions, then I thank both of you, Allan and And Jorge, and please, yeah, if you want, you can have an applause. We have two small gifts to you. So Allan, please come over here. And this concludes our today's seminar. Thank you all for listening and coming in.